Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Developer Express. Become a UI superhero with DevExpress controls and libraries. Deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today. By leveraging your existing knowledge, you can build next-generation touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. You can download your free 30-day trial at dx.hanselminutes.com. That's dx.hanselminutes.com.
From hanselminutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 560. In this episode, Scott talks with Nolan Lawson about the concept of progressive enhancement and how it applies to web apps today.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Nolan Lawson. He's a program manager on the Edge team. But I'm actually not talking to you about Edge. I want to talk to you about something different. You put a blog post out recently, and it started kind of an interesting debate.
Yeah, I guess you could call it that. It was definitely interesting.
What was the controversy?
Well, I wrote a blog post called Progressive Enhancement Isn't Dead, but It Smells Funny. And this was kind of a response to a talk that I gave recently at FrontiersConf in Amsterdam, where I made some sort of controversial statements about progressive enhancement. And with some folks, it went over pretty well. With other folks, it did not go over well. And so this blog post was my attempt to sort of clear up my position on the issue and to continue the debate.
Okay, so let's back up and let's talk to the audience about what is progressive enhancement for the developer who's on their way to work right now and their boss wants them to make it work on all browsers.
Yeah, so progressive enhancement is kind of a loaded term. A lot of people use it for a lot of different meanings. But in my mind, there are sort of two different major interpretations of it. There's the sort of broad version that says the way that you should build websites is you should start with a basis of functionality. What is the core value proposition of this website? And then make sure that that works using the simplest possible technology. And then enhance upward based on that. So this is kind of in contrast to graceful degradation, where you would build your whizzy, snappy, feature complete, has all the bells and whistles website. And then for browsers that don't support XYZ feature, you just kind of peel those features back. And the argument goes that the progressive enhancement approach is kind of more battle-tested. It's more foolproof. So there's that definition of progressive enhancement, which I think is actually a very sensible way to build websites. And then there's also a sort of more narrow definition, a more classical definition of progressive enhancement, which is that you should start with HTML as your baseline of functionality, and then layer CSS on top of that as another layer, and then JavaScript as another layer. And this is commonly interpreted as you should make your websites work without JavaScript.
So if you say you should make your websites work without JavaScript, that seems like a reasonable statement. It doesn't seem controversial. For someone who's got many years of history on the web, make it work with HTML, text boxes, forms. Like we did just fine without JavaScript for many, many years. And now that very, very inexpensive, very, very low end, devices can work great with just HTML, that seems like a totally non-controversial statement.
Well, it ends up being a very controversial statement because, as it turns out, this is largely not the way that people are building websites today. So I mentioned in my blog post that there's lots of examples of major websites that just do not work at all without JavaScript. Facebook, Instagram, these are sites that if you go to them, you'll either be greeted with a totally blank page or maybe some nice little notice saying, hey, we require JavaScript and you should enable JavaScript in order to surf the web on our page.
Interesting. So I have a talk about JavaScript where I tease people about not working with JavaScript because ultimately we do recognize that JavaScript makes things better. But doesn't it come down to whether or not you want your audience to be bigger or not, right? Is this about like the vegan CrossFitters that also don't run with JavaScript? You know what I mean? Like they're just like, yeah, I don't have a television and I run with JavaScript disabled. Is this about making them happy, or is this about making the millions and millions of people with smaller low-end devices that don't have the power to run JavaScript on a mobile device?
Well, and that's actually exactly the point where I kind of take exception with the narrow version of JavaScript, is that I actually don't think that it enhances your target audience by quite so much, maybe as it used to. So I think maybe back when the basis of functionality was something like IE6, where you really couldn't be sure whether this thing was going to reliably run your JavaScript or not, because it wasn't very feature rich, and a lot of the features were very buggy or slow. So it made a lot of sense to just cut off JavaScript for such browsers. I think it's a technique that I believe the BBC called cutting the mustard. But what I point out in this blog post is that, hey, when I build web applications myself nowadays, especially progressive web applications, I find that my basis of functionality is, say, a 3 or 4 year old Android phone, a very low end kind of Android phone that might be popular in a place like India or Southeast Asia or Nigeria. And these devices, they have auto-updating browsers. They can run the latest JavaScript features available for the web platform. And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to constrain myself to this no JavaScript world. Like, who exactly am I making my websites more accessible to when I do that?
Interesting. Okay, but is it then maybe not a no JavaScript or like full Angular Gmail kind of an application, or is this just a matter of light JavaScript? I mean, if you go to a website like The Verge, it's like the homepage is several megs, and Lord knows how many different half dozen or a dozen asynchronous JavaScript libraries all coming in and jabbering at each other all at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or, does it?
No, it absolutely doesn't need to. So this is a very complex issue, and there's a lot of subtleties here. And the arguments against a website like The Verge or any website that overuses JavaScript, which, I mean, arguably is a lot of the web right now. This is actually, I would argue, as someone who works on the performance team on Microsoft Edge, that is the number one performance problem on the web these days, is overuse of JavaScript.
Really?
But,
so it's not slow internet or slow CPU. It's just JavaScript doing things in the background, and that's just not necessary.
Oh yeah, and you don't have to ask me. All you have to do is ask your CPU fan. I mean, you go to the average website these days, and you hear your fans slowly start to whir as it wind up as it's
really?
running all these. A lot of it is ads and trackers, but also a lot of it is just kind of sloppy use of JavaScript. So that being said, I feel like it's possible to hold the opinion that JavaScript is overused, and we should learn how to use it more judiciously, and to use features like code splitting and server-side rendering to limit our JavaScript, while also saying that I don't think it's extremely valuable to make a website work, even the core value proposition of a website work without JavaScript.
How does this mean that we don't end up writing two websites completely, two entirely different websites?
Well, and that's kind of the challenge, right? And that's the challenge that I would pose to classical progressive enhancement advocates who would look at a site like Instagram and say, "Hey, this is silly. Like, why is it showing me a blank screen without JavaScript? It could, and you could build Instagram with an input field to upload a file and an image tag, right? That's what they say. But you're right. I mean, you would effectively then have to build two different versions of Instagram, because it is a very rich client-side JavaScript application as written. And so my response to that is that JavaScript frameworks have largely kind of risen to the occasion on this. And the modern JavaScript frameworks like React and Angular 2 and Ember and Vue.js, they all have features where you can you can write your app as a pure client-side JavaScript application, full JavaScript code base. You don't even have to have any HTML or CSS in there at all. And then you can use features like server-side rendering to do and code splitting to do intelligent splitting of this JavaScript to render on the server side or to render at build time into HTML, CSS, JavaScript as your build target. And that is a good practice to do, because the classical progressive enhancement advocates are 100% right that it tends to be better for first load performance to send down HTML and CSS and then have minimal JavaScript after that. For first load performance, that is way faster than sending down empty markup, like an empty body tag, say, and then a script tag, a gigantic script tag that just renders everything.
So, okay, let me see if I can peel this away because, like you said, it is complicated. So you're saying that if you don't have JavaScript, certainly it's unacceptable to just show up and just get like an empty white screen. You know, if you go to one of the Tumblrs like Sci JavaScript, you can see examples where it's like the site looks great with JavaScript, you turn it off and it just either breaks like no one even thought to do that, or you get just chunks of stuff. But you keep using this term splitting. Can you parse that out for me?
Yes, I'd love to define that. But real quick, I want to assert that I actually don't think it's unacceptable to have a page that gives a white screen without JavaScript. I mean, this is the way that many people are building websites today. However, I think that it's a performance boost to apply server-side rendering, aka progressive enhancement, through techniques like server-side React, server-side Angular. Now, as for code splitting, that's the idea that instead of shipping down one gigantic monolithic JavaScript bundle on first load that does everything and anything that your entire website might do, your entire, let's say, single page app might do, you split it up based on functionality. So that when I go to the home page, like, do I really need a bunch of JavaScript that tells me that renders the about page or renders the credits page or renders the contact us page? No, I'm probably never even going to click on those. So it's really silly to ship down all that JavaScript on first load.
I see. So that, again, that's funny that it's just such a different perspective from the front end and the back end. You're simply saying that JavaScript folks and front end folks should apply single responsibility principles and have those go all the way out to their deployment, their deployment process and the unit of measurement, the unit of work rather. The modules should reflect the work that's being done, and you shouldn't be bringing down, system.js that represents everything that the site could ever potentially do. It should be broken up into pieces. But it's easy because we all have 30 megabit connections and fast computers, so we design for a user that we think is us when it turns out they never really are us.
Yeah, and this is the real challenge that I see. The challenge is to fix our tooling, is to fix our build systems so that it's very easy, it's very ergonomic to build using whatever methods you want, which more and more is just almost purely JavaScript, and then have that output as a build target, some very optimized format for your website. And I think the JavaScript frameworks of 2016 all do this. Like server-side rendering is now table stakes for any respectable JavaScript framework.
Mm-hmm. So you said at your talk at Frontiers in Amsterdam, you had a slide that said, in 2016, it's okay to build a website that doesn't work without JavaScript. And that was where it went south.
Yes, that is where someone took a picture of me and then it got retweeted hundreds of times. And there were lots of notables in the web community who had some choice words for me in that slide. They very vociferously disagreed with it.
So they're saying, to be clear, let's just reverse that. In 2016, it is not okay to build a website that doesn't work without JavaScript. They want JavaScript to be bread and butter of the web.
Yeah, the arguments that I saw were things like, hey, just because Gmail and Facebook and Instagram and other big sites do this doesn't mean you should too. And hey, you should be doing this because of accessibility. You should be doing this because of feature phones running proxy browsers. Hey, you should be doing this because of performance, which is the thing that I actually really agree with. Mm-hmm. It's kind of it's a very long-standing accepted wisdom, this approach. And I think that when I said that, it kind of hit a nerve, because I think what I showed is that there's actually a very big divide between what is the traditional accepted wisdom, like you go and buy an O'Reilly book and it tells you to do this, and then the way people are actually building websites. And the way that I approach it is that the way I see people building websites is that they don't even think to go into their settings and turn off JavaScript and see what the page looks like. Like, it has never even crossed their mind. That is just not how people build websites nowadays. And I'm happy to just kind of accept that reality and then to work with developers from there and say, hey, but have you tried turning off JavaScript? Because if you do, you get a different view of your website, and you get a view of your website that might, give you an idea of how you can improve the loading performance, how you can show the user an initial view of your page using HTML and CSS even before the JavaScript loads. I'd prefer to have that conversation rather than sort of dogmatic, like, no, you're doing it wrong. Stop doing it wrong.
Yeah, see, that seems very reasonable. From my perspective, that seems like user empathy. It seems like no different than saying we should put alt tags on our images because we should think about the low vision people. Like you should look at the various angles that someone comes into your site and looks at it with, different perspectives, and, understand what it looks like. And you're saying that there is a class of people out there who don't have JavaScript, so let's take a look. It sounds like that simply saying that it's okay to build a website that doesn't work without JavaScript is there's missing too much context.
Yeah, and there's different degrees to all of this. Like, in fact, I think one place where developers get hung up on this is they think, who has JavaScript disabled? Like, nobody has JavaScript disabled. But it's not even so much about that. The strongest argument for progressive enhancement, this traditional progressive enhancement approach, is just that JavaScript takes a while to come down, and your users don't have JavaScript when the JavaScript hasn't loaded yet. And so it's a missed opportunity if you send down empty markup and then wait for your gigantic JavaScript bundle to download, to parse, to execute before you render anything. Like, that's a missed opportunity. You could show the user some, initial view of your page, at least a background color or something, which increases the perceived performance of the page. And this is the way that I always like to talk about it, as a performance boost, not as like a moral imperative or something, because I think the actual number of users who are without JavaScript is becoming vanishingly small every year. And so that's not the right way to argue it, I believe.
Okay, so then this is about responsible use of JavaScript, appropriate use of JavaScript. To your point, they might have Android devices. The next billion people who come online will be on smartphones. They will have a browser that gets updated. And it's probably less important that we worry about JavaScript and more important that we worry about the reliability of their internet connection.
Yeah, and that's actually the big point that I was trying to get across in my blog post is that, hey, we're living in a world now where people have very capable smartphones, very capable browsers, and what's not reliable at all is the network. Like, if you look at the quality of network connections around the world, it's quite poor, and in some places it's even getting poorer. Like, I read a report by Twin Prime that said that even in the US, LTE speeds have slowed by 50% in the last year, just because so many more people are coming onto these networks and they're getting saturated. And the solution that I propose to that is to use APIs in the browser available on the client side that allow you to cache data locally and to prefer the local network, or to prefer the local cache at all times instead of going to the network, which is slow, unreliable, unresponsive. And this is usually put under the umbrella of offline first, this idea of preferring the local cache.
It's so interesting that we have been talking about that, it feels like, since, 2011, 2012. And here we are with doing all kinds of amazing 3D things with CSS and pushing JavaScript to amazing levels. But we also have this nice kind of basically SQL Server database and file system inside of JavaScript. And we would rather download, a 40K or even a 400K PNG than put the effort into downloading, for example, the product catalog for our website as JSON, and then doing all of our work locally on that product catalog, and as opposed to constantly paging through stuff. Why are we spending time bringing down hero images and not the database and then doing all the work on the client side?
I think the answer to that is that it's just really hard. Like, this is actually kind of my area of expertise. I work on an open source project called PouchDB, which is an abstraction layer over IndexedDB. And so I'm very familiar with all these browser storage mechanisms.
That's Pouch with a P?
With a P. It's a pun on CouchDB. Yeah, it's essentially a CouchDB that runs in your browser. To be honest, like, a lot of these technologies didn't really reach maturity until recently. I mean, as little as 3 years ago, you didn't have IndexedDB in browsers like Safari or in older versions of Android. You didn't have Service Worker. Service Worker is quite new. Before that, you had Application Cache, which is now deprecated, but was really, really hard to work with. But it was basically the only way to get reliable offline support in your site. And so I think that there's increasing interest now. There's especially increasing interest because Google, in particular, have been pushing very hard on this with their progressive web apps idea, which the other browser vendors like Edge and Firefox are very much behind now. And they've been pushing ideas of offline first. because they recognize this reality of the network being very, very poor, but browsers being quite capable these days.
Mm-hmm. And there's also more and more recognition about what the server's good at and what the client's good at. And I like that you're pointing out that these devices, these what we think of as low-end devices, are certainly more powerful than the desktops we had 10 years ago. So let's get them doing a little bit of work, but let's be responsible about what their job is and what the server's job is.
Yes, absolutely. It's critical to just be aware of the trade-offs, like the trade-offs in things like, do you value first page load versus subsequent page load? Is your site mostly about consumption, or is it about interaction and synchronization? I mean, if you're building a static site, like I think that building it as HTML first is perfectly valid. That's a really good way to do it. And you can still get the best of both worlds. There's emerging frameworks like Gatsby and Next.js that allow you to essentially build a static site that then has a service worker that handles, and a client-side library that handles client-side rendering, service worker rendering, and then server-side rendering when it needs to. So I think the tooling is getting better and better to the point where this whole issue of do you write HTML first or do you write JavaScript first, I think it's going to matter less and less. It's going to be a question of how good are our tools and what are they outputting as a build target.
Could you parse out this idea of isomorphic JavaScript a little bit? That might be a term that people who are listening are not 100% familiar with.
Sure, that's a good point. Yeah. So isomorphic JavaScript is this idea that kind of started to gain popularity, I think, a couple of years ago because of a blog post from Airbnb, where the idea is essentially that you write JavaScript such that you can easily run it either on the server side or on the client side. And when you run it on the server side, you typically would run it in something like Node.js. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to rewrite your entire server in Node. You might just have a little child process or something, or it might just be a part of your build process for your JavaScript. But you want to have this flexibility of, say when you want to do form validation, you need to do that on both the server side and the client side. And it's very efficient if you can just write that code once, run it on the client, and then also run it on the server and not have to have two separate code bases that you keep in sync.
Interesting. Okay. And is it even now popular to have people do server-side initial, what do they call it? Initial load rendering, initial page rendering? Like I think that people talk about that, but I don't necessarily see it in the wild.
Yeah, it's becoming easier and easier. I mean, like I said, I think it's table stakes now for a modern JavaScript framework, but it was definitely not the standard, even just a few years ago. Like Angular 1 didn't really have any way of doing this. And so people writing Angular applications who ran up against these performance problems or these problems of SEO, and they realized that they needed some kind of static version of their website. They were doing things like, loading it in Phantom.js, which is a headless browser. So you actually load the site in Phantom.js, run all the JavaScript, and then spit that out to a string, essentially, to an HTML file. All these hoops to jump through to get this isomorphic JavaScript experience. And nowadays, any framework worth its salt has some kind of isomorphic offering.
Yeah, there was some cool work happening on ASP.NET. The ASP.NET team, specifically a guy named Steve Sanderson, who wrote Knockout.js. When ASP.NET people do Angular apps, they'll have their back end, producing JSON or whatever, and then their front end might be Angular or something else. ASP.NET will use Node to go and do that first page render on the server side. So it's a kind of it shells out to Node and then does, whatever the templating engine needs to be rendered at that time. So you're right. That needs to be effortless. It needs to just know and be part of the system. You shouldn't have to write that code yourself these days.
Right. And more it's becoming a kind of turnkey solution. I mean, if it's a lot of work, then people aren't going to do it, as we learn over and over again with everything related to performance, which is why, again, I think this is not so much an issue of how you author your websites, whether you prefer to start with HTML or whether you are a React developer who wants to do everything in JSX and you want to have CSS in JavaScript and you just want to live in a JavaScript world. I think that matters less nowadays, and it matters more how sophisticated are our tools and do they easily allow us to output the most performant websites.
Yeah. So there's websites that are performance focused. There's websites that can work on JavaScript or not. But you also had this comment around the idea of a robust web app. Like, what does it mean for an app to be robust? It has to handle a number of different suboptimal scenarios, right?
Yeah, and this is a point that's often argued in favor of the classical progressive enhancement model. They'll say things like, what if the user starts receiving the HTML and the CSS, and then the user goes into a tunnel, and the JavaScript doesn't load? And so
sounds funny, but it does happen.
No, it definitely does happen. Yeah, but then I wouldn't necessarily extrapolate from there that that is a reason for me to make my site work, like actually be functional without JavaScript, like 100% functional.
The tunnle scenario.
Yes, the tunnel scenario. And my argument against that I gave in my talk was, well, I've seen that happen plenty of times. I've also seen it happen on, say, GitHub, where the CSS didn't load. And if you see what it looks like without the CSS, it's actually almost totally unusable. Like it is, it doesn't look like anything. You can barely interact with it. So at which point I wouldn't really attempt to interact with the page at all. To put it another way, I think Laurie Voss from NPM had a response to my blog post where he said that if you are building a website that is primarily focused on interaction and you need JavaScript for your interaction, then if the JavaScript doesn't load on the first load, then it's just broken. Like there's no two ways around it. And so my belief is that for rich, immersive client-side applications, focusing less on that initial load and more on the offline scenario will get you bigger wins. Like what happens on the subsequent loads? How do you deal with the case where the application is loaded, JavaScript is activated, but the network goes in and out, or it doesn't just go in and out. Maybe the network appears to be there, but then when you make a request, you don't get a response. Jake Archibald has called this Li-Fi, and I think we've all experienced it. And thinking about those scenarios, I think leads to better web applications.
Yeah, I'm getting to the point where you're right. The LTE is slower. You have a page with 15 different external dependencies. Maybe there are other JavaScripts that are blocking the page. It could be DNS. Every time you add a new thing to your page, it potentially could go down and then potentially cause your page to just hang in a strange state.
Yeah, at which point, I think most people would just reasonably refresh or come back later. And that's acceptable for some websites. It's not acceptable for other ones. If you're making a content site, like a blog, and your primary goal is to deliver words to your user, like that, I think that should work without JavaScript. That should maybe even work without CSS. Like your primary goal is to deliver content from the server to the client. But for web applications that are interactive and that, synchronize data, maybe you store data locally, and then when the network goes offline, you continue allowing the user to work with the data, and then when they come back online, you sync that data back. I think that trying to make that work without JavaScript is a fool's errand.
That makes total sense to me. Like if you want the, customer got on a plane, worked for 3 hours on your website and then landed scenario, or they just went through a tunnel scenario to work. Of course, it's folly to do that without JavaScript. But that gets to the progressive part of enhancement, right? If you have this, then good things happen. If you have that, then even better things happen, and on and on.
Yeah, which is a very good way to think about things. I am totally pro progressive enhancement in the broad sense. Using features like for instance, Service Worker is a great example of this. It's designed from the ground up to work with progressive enhancement. For browsers that don't support Service Worker, you just get a normal web page, and then for browsers that do, you get this really snappy offline experience where you can do lots of fancy stuff inside of the Service Worker, and that's totally a valid way of building web applications. I think it's a very sensible way to do it.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a left turn, but I was thinking about looking at your blog post. You had a discussion around module bloat and how many different JavaScript modules get loaded. And, some might be 100, and other websites like Apple might have 1,000 modules. How much of that JavaScript is actually being used versus how much of it's just being handed to me and then never run? Like, shouldn't there be some kind of, they call it tree trimming or tree shaking, where only the JavaScript that's being run is shipped to me?
Yeah, that's another blog post I wrote recently called The Cost of Small Modules, where I kind of showed that we're using these tools like Browserify and Webpack to turn our JavaScript code base, which frequently has lots of tiny little modules, into one big bundle. And just the cost of those modules themselves, just the overhead of the sheer number of modules, really slows down the performance of a page.
Yeah.
And actually, to my previous point, if those modules are unused, then code splitting will help you out quite a bit there. And most of the bundlers support some kind of code splitting. But what I was trying to raise the alarm about in that blog post was, hey, the JavaScript ecosystem, because of the way that Node and NPM work, has gotten very fond of kind of hyper modularity. Like everyone loves these like 1-3-line modules. Or even if you think you're using one quote unquote module, under the hood, it could have many, many small files. And those actually add up because of the way that our tools work, because of the way our bundlers work. And to their credit, the bundler authors that I've spoken with have said, yes, this is a real problem. And yes, they're working on fixing it. So Webpack 2 is actually in the process of fixing this. And to your point about tree shaking, that is something they've already implemented in Webpack 2 beta now, where the idea is that if something is unused in your JavaScript code base, it should just be shaken out. It should just be removed.
Right. Right. We should not be zipping up the complete tree of all dependencies of everything that I could ever potentially use and then shipping it over, and then 10% of it gets run.
Yeah. And this is the kind of thing that would be solved by tree shaking and code splitting. But again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how I think the primary thing we should target in trying to fix these sorts of issues is with tooling. Like, we shouldn't admonish web developers for building in a particular way. The reason that people build JavaScript first is because it's so easy. It's so fast. They can get started in 5 minutes building a really rich client-side web application. And that's great. And we should enable that developer productivity. But our tools should be smart enough to do these kinds of things by default. Do things like tree shaking and module inlining, which I talk about in this post, to deliver the most compact, smallest bundle of JavaScript possible, and also HTML and CSS when appropriate. Okay,
so as we close out, where can people go and learn about this? Like you are, these because you're in the community. People who are listening might find this to be all very overwhelming, and now they're realizing they have to read 16 different, blog posts in order to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, I probably dropped a lot of buzzwords. I'm not sure what my buzzwords per minute was. And then
I try to stop people when the buzzword comes out.
That's fair. Well, you can go to my blog at nolanlawson.com. These are the two most recent blog posts that I wrote, the progressive enhancement one and the small modules one. I also have my talks listed, so you can go and watch me rant about this stuff in video format if that's what you prefer. I also have links in those posts to follow-up posts where you can follow the discussion and see how the debate progressed back and forth.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks, Scott.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes. We'll see you again next week.